Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Matthew for making this entry. He was not supposed to be able to come at all. And so I appreciate his generous remarks, and I appreciate the time we spent together beginning in the '97 labor campaign, and also the time in the policy unit and number 10 through the 3 elections. And also to the RSA for jumping on the chance to do this event, which is at the outset of a week-long book tour that I'll do in Britain for this book, Dispatches from the War Room. So I thank the RSA and also thank them for their broad program of exploring the public domain, and hopefully this book will contribute to that understanding. Peter is very gracious in doing this. He'll be a moderator and I'm sure a critic before we're done. You'll see when you read the book that I've continually used him as a sounding board. I see much of what's happening through his eyes. I sometimes disagree. His books have been fully exploited into the narrative, of the book. So on some issues, I'm not sure. In fact, I was at the time more critical of what he said, and now in some sense more appreciative. I'm not trying to avoid being attacked tonight, but I do want to note it for the record. This book is the story of 5 bold leaders who won election in times of change and then struggled to bring people with them and to govern successfully. That's not a bad context for trying to understand what's happening now in Britain. It's not, and for sure, I think it's a framework that makes sense in trying to understand where Barack Obama is going. And I will come back. I will try to make those connections as we go forward. My focus today is on what I do, which I've been asked to do by the RSA, on what I do as the, quote, De Niro of polling to help or elevate Democratic leaders or diminish them, as the case may be. And so speaking here in Britain, where hospitality to spin doctors is not very strong, I do risk. Fortunately, I am ambivalent, and I am ambivalent enough about what I do that I can probably get past the filter that you have for listening to spin doctors. This is a memoir, so I try to answer the questions about what I do through the work and the process of discovery, which made this actually a quite difficult book to write. It violates all the principles I ever taught as a professor and as a mentor to people in my company, that if you don't know what you want to say, you almost certainly can't write very well. I actually did not know the conclusions of this book before I wrote it, so that there is a process of discovery and I hope a drama about the events as well. I have 2 starting points in life and in politics, and thus it's why I wrote this book. First is people, and I know this will seem innocent, but I first focused on the voter as a graduate student at Harvard, where V.O. Key, an American political scientist, a student of voting behavior and American voters, who died before I got there, but wrote a book, an unpublished book, or a partially written book, where he concluded with the simple message that voters are not fools. And began, I think, a long process, which I hope you see in this book, of respecting voters, understanding how they look past the spin, discern what's really happening, begin with a caution about what political leaders say, and too much of the assumptions about the power of spin doctors begins with a lack of respect for voters. I begin with a respect for voters that carries through this, and viewed my work, from the beginning, first as an academic and then as a political pollster in campaigns, as trying to figure out how to get leaders to respect people, how to make leaders more responsive, how to make them ultimately more accountable. The problem is that I'm now a pollster, a close cousin to spin doctor, which has the profession in American terms of making shit shine. of making things the opposite of what they are, manipulating, making reality seem the opposite of what it is. And so the danger, and which I take as real, I didn't write this book as a defense of my profession or of what I do. My starting point is I'm not sure that the tools that I developed to make leaders more accountable to voters isn't in fact making them less accountable. I was particularly focused, as I wrote this book, on the United States, where there was building evidence of leaders holding on to power despite being out of touch with voters on an extraordinary range of issues. But leaders growing more arrogant, seeming they could avoid accountability. And my techniques are not a small part of the process of avoiding accountability. So my starting point is, am I in fact making the problem worse that I set out to solve? Second is my own political project. My own views were shaped by the 1960s, as are many, and particularly in an American context by 1968, an election which in effect was a choice for a generation between Robert Kennedy, Gene McCarthy, and Richard Nixon. And ultimately Richard Nixon. And where people ended up in life, it very much had to do with the choices they took at that moment in time. And the political project that emerged for me, that was not clear at the time to me, and it's only clear to me as I look back on the work I've done, is the work I've done both as an academic, but then in campaign after campaign, working to unite a bottom-up majority to win power, to improve life broadly, and to offset inequality. That's what motivated me coming out of the Robert Kennedy campaign that stood out. He was a candidate who uniquely was able to win, white ethnic Catholic voters and African-American voters and bring them together in the same coalition. He was assassinated. And it may only be, perhaps with Bill Clinton and certainly with Barack Obama, that we've transcended, that we've been able in the U.S. to get past that, that political project on the progressive side. But that mission carried with me to all the leaders that I was working for as I look at what led me to both to my academic books and ultimately to these leaders. It led me to work to them in an accumulative way, trying to advance that project, to build a majority, a progressive majority from the bottom up, uniting people to improve life in a broad way, not just for the privileged few, and to offset inequality. So it led me to leaders, looking at these leaders who have a political purpose. I'm going to talk about all these. These are leaders who have a political purpose, a political project, and a life mission that intersects at a big election. These are leaders who are attentive to public opinion as part of their leadership. Again, I'll develop each of these points. And they are leaders who attempted to control the meaning of their public moment, both in the election that they ran and in the way that they govern. Let me start with the political purpose. Each of these leaders emerged in a tumultuous moment when voters were demanding change, some even, dramatic change, some wanting a complete break with the past, certainly thinking of Mandela, wanting a complete break with the past. And they got their moment because they stood out from the rest of the leaders and parties in their intensity, their ambition, their focus, their understanding and crystallization of the critique of the times they were in, and offering a choice that made them the leader, the leader for that moment in time. Clinton was a different kind of Democrat, and Blair gave us New Labor. Ehud Barak in Israel promised to get Israel unstuck from the extremists and to allow Israel to get back the Rabin's way after his assassination. Mandela would end apartheid and white rule and bring a new non-racial South Africa. And Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, known as Goni in Bolivia, would be a strong leader to end the economic crisis, was the basis on which he came to power. What I learned from writing the book, these leaders' political mission crystallized in the campaign and the election, but it was only a point of intersection. They had a political project I understood at the moment of the election, but that was only a moment of intersection between their political project and their life's mission. And they intersected in a way that was quite powerful at the time of these elections, but these were much more complicated leaders who had underlying set of beliefs that was part of their motivation for being there. And I did not know them well enough at the time of these elections to understand this intersection. But it also may well be that they intended for there to be that gap in knowledge. I'll give an example. Bill Clinton. Okay. Bill Clinton ran under the theme of the forgotten middle class, returning the Democratic Party to the middle class. Democratic Party, renewing the Democratic Party so it could be trusted to govern. But his underlying default position at every point in the way was not the forgotten middle class. His default position was trying to overcome the racial division that had kept black and white apart in America and kept America from celebrating its diversity. So his underlying mission was unity and diversity. Not the forgotten middle class. Now, at the point of the 1992 election, his political project fully intersected with the goal of bringing black and white together. But what motivated me in coming to that project and what motivated him were different things. And so you continually faced with a Bill Clinton, him wanting to announce at Little Rock High School, where Governor Faubus had resisted, the desegregation of the schools. He wanted to end his campaign in a black church, not a white church, where I wanted, on Victory Night in 1992, after we ran on the economy, stupid, and the middle class. He mentioned the economy once, middle class not at all, and said the most important issue in this election was the unity of the country. Now, it's not that he was running under false pretenses. We have leaders who have convictions, have life purpose, which comes in that intersects with a political moment when they run an election. We had a moment in time, what was called Macomb County with Bill Clinton, where we were bringing white working class voters together with black voters. His focus was the black voters, my focus was the white voters. We came to the same end, but I really didn't quite understand his motivation. And if you look at the end of his presidency in the last 2 years, what he focused on was diversity. And making diversity a strength, multiculturalism. There are very few countries, as we know, here or in Europe or elsewhere, where there is a willingness to recognize diversity as a strength. He made Hillary Clinton possible as a presidential candidate, and he made Barack Obama possible as a presidential candidate out of his life's mission, which overlapped with his political project but were not the same thing. The same thing was true of Tony Blair. And since you're much more familiar with Tony Blair, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I'm happy to come back to it. But his default was community, responsibility, and opportunity, which I misread to be the same as third way language and a third way project in the sense of America's New Democrats. As you know, it was in fact much more religiously grounded in the idea that individuals can only realize their ambition in community and the power of community, and that became a central organizing idea and only crystallized for him, not in '97 when he was first elected, but after 9/11 and with the Iraq War, where there was an alignment at last, of his personal life mission, religiously grounded, with his political project. So we're dealing with leaders, and I can do this with each of these leaders. They all have a political project that they bring to the election. They all have a life's mission which intersects with that. But these are complex people with purpose. These are not simple people taking their readings from polls. They all poll extensively. I'll come back to it. They all poll extensively, but these are leaders who came to this with a project. The second point about them is the fact that all these leaders were solicitous of public opinion, which I have come to take now not as an evidence of weakness, but actually a measure of strength of character and strength of leadership. Now, Clinton was my entry point to this understanding about these leaders, as he's the one, accused of being poll-driven, finger to the wind, inauthentic, no backbone, and firm conviction, and I was his pollster. But Tony Blair, was also accused of being driven by focus groups and polls. Voters, weren't sure he wasn't smarmy and unreal. There was lots of uncertainty about his authenticity, and spin doctoring and polling was very much part of the characterization of his leadership. So my first instinct in writing, when I began writing this book, and in fact this is what I thought I was going to write, was to focus on the critical spaces in which Bill Clinton did not poll. Since he's been characterized as poll-driven, I happen to know that in the year before he considered running for president, Bill Clinton didn't do any polling while he was head of the Democratic Leadership Council, the moderate Democratic group, before he ran. He did not do a poll before he announced for president. He did not do a poll before he began his New Covenant speeches where he set out his vision for his presidency. He did not, even though he was challenged by opponents of free trade in the primary, dangerously at risk by those opponents, and by Ross Perot in the general election. He was a free trader. We did not poll on those positions. He adopted an austerity budget that jeopardized what he ran on for president. After the election, he did not poll on that approach. He was intensely poll-driven in terms of figuring out how to present that budget to the country, but there were very broad spaces in which he did not poll, and I could go through the same with Tony Blair, and which I won't. But there are broad areas in which he did not poll. I thought that's where I was going to go. What I really came out of after spending time focused on these leaders was that I am more intrigued by Bill Clinton's passion for engaging and understanding people. My first meeting, he was so focused on how he was going to win people over. He was thinking about, this was a race for governor before president, but how he was going to win people over, how he was going to engage with them, understanding what they were thinking, how he was going to win them over. He was incredibly excited about that possibility. The energy he got by being on the rope line, seeing people, the energy he got when he had to fight back with people's support in New Hampshire. The 15 minutes that I had with him each week, and during most of those 15 minutes, I would give him postcards from focus groups that people wrote at the end of groups, where they would write a postcard to the president, anything you want to say to him, and him reading that, and how much he would take, from that, amidst the bubble that makes it so hard to be in touch, as a leader. What I concluded was that's what gave him the strength to try to sell his budget, which he began to get, which had produced the basis for the economic growth of the 90s. That was the basis of which he probably risked too much in trying to achieve universal, health care. It was people who supported him when he went through the impeachment process, but it was his bond, his relationship with people, that is an aspect of his leadership that I look at and say, that's the piece I respect. I recognize there are areas where you just move. But his bond with people was central to who he was, as a leader. Mandela, we have no doubt that Nelson Mandela, knows what he believes and his purpose and direction. Okay, but Nelson Mandela was consumed with polling and focus groups. He wanted to head up the polling program. He sat through a 3-hour poll, presentation. He wanted to be there not just for, the summary, of executive high points of the poll, but wanted to have the whole breakout of, this. He was consumed with the ANC being in touch with voters. He uniquely, having been in jail for 27 years, but also the exile leaders who are coming back, they thought that they were a liberation movement, not a Democratic Party. He went to focus groups at critical points in which he got it that they were being seen as out of touch. This process was leaving people behind, that they had to find ways to re-engage. The same thing happened on relating to people during the campaign. Same thing happened after 3 years, 3 years in government, where where the leaders would not believe, the other leaders would not believe that voters did not give them credit for progress and change after having ended apartheid, ended segregation, expanded access to water and electricity, that they had, free prenatal care, primary health care. But despite all that, they had not produced the housing that they had promised and the jobs they promised, and voters were in despair and angry. And he was the only one. I was attacked for rigging the polls, having unrepresentative polls. It was one of the toughest presentations to say to folks that you're on the gravy train. They perceive you as on the gravy train, out of touch, not in touch with their lives. Mandela was the one who was understood that being in touch was critical to their success. So Mandela, and when you look at all of these leaders, you begin to realize as you look across them, they worked to be in tune with the public. There's a looking over your shoulders as you're heading down the road. Keeping in mind these leaders, in my view, all have a project, both political and personal, that's driving what they're doing. They are reporting back on progress to maintain support. They are engaged, with people and trying to mobilize them at various times as they're trying to bring pressures on others. They're trying to educate people. They're trying to persuade, and move people. And so what is characteristic of these leaders, was a solicitousness about public opinion, that a sense of responsibility to educate and engage, which made them much more effective. In normative sense, made them, in my sense, more, made them democratic leaders that produce a healthier society, healthier outcomes. Also made them more effective, politically. But it also said to me that, going back to my original purpose, that leaders, even with very clear sense of purpose, they are much more effective if they are responsive and accountable to people and solicit public opinion. And that contrast, and what brought it home more than anything, was George Bush and Vice President Cheney. Vice President Cheney in particular, when asked by a reporter about when he was in Iraq, noting that 2/3 of the American people thought the Iraq war was a mistake, and what he thought of that. And he paused, and his response was, "So." That's all he said. He said, "We don't derive our mission from focus groups and polls. Maybe if they had thought that part of their responsibility as leaders was try to persuade and engage and educate, they would have pursued different kinds of policies as they went forward. But clearly, these leaders understood that they had responsibilities to engage and educate. The third aspect of these leaders was the attempt to control the meaning of elections. And I'll focus on this because that has a lot to do with what I do, and what's distinctive about what I do. Now, I'll have to be honest. The reason people hire me is because they think I help them win. I know that's crude, but I didn't believe that when I started the book. Because in almost all the cases that I'm writing about, I either have an academic history or a political history, or I've written, theoretically about political dynamics in the country and what will bring the change. But it was a rude awakening for me in all these places to discover, particularly above all South Africa. Where I was an academic, wrote 2 books on South Africa, where I was testified in behalf of the anti-apartheid movement, lost my visa over supporting sanctions, and so I presume that might have had something to do with why they wanted me to come over. But no, they saw the Newsweek magazine with the Bill Clinton's the special issue on Clinton's victory, and they looked at that account and they simply said, "We want them." The people who had brought who created Bill Clinton's war room, and brought that victory. In reality, it's more than that, even if they don't know it. And so I can share that with you in this intimate setting. They wanted to win in the right way. And by the right way, I mean that they wanted, one, to increase the probability of winning, but they also wanted to have a majority that was big enough so that others would yield to them when it came to governance, and they wanted to define the moment of change with such clarity and power that they were in a much better chance of governing successfully once in office. So that they were trying to use the forces at work in society and to define it in a way that they had the strongest possible result, and the meaning was understood to people. So my starting point as a professor, and when I began to move from being a professor to campaigns, was a book by E. Schatzsnyder called The Semi-Sovereign People, who argued that whoever controls what the fight's about wins, which I've been testing in election after election for my entire life, and I believe it to be true. That who determines what is politics about runs the country, because they define the alternatives. If you succeed, your policies, your coalitions of interests are the ones that matters, and the opponents, are condemned to irrelevance. If you control what the choice is, what is the election about? And so more than anything else in my work, I try to understand the moment, and all these leaders were moments in which the country was desperate for change. And understanding what that dynamic was around change enabled you to choose the fight. And so my surveys, above all, are an attempt to, I hope in as objective way as possible, to define that choice, that critical alternative. With Mandela, when I began that campaign, the defining choice was, now is the time. That's what the ANC was running on. That was their slogans. The rallies would come. Large numbers of people were there around that slogan. But voters were demoralized. They were not engaged in the election. ANC support was not, strong. And ultimately, what I argued for was a choice that centered on a better life for all. That what now is the time means is blacks will take power. That's the definition. That's the choice. A better life for all says that it's inclusive, and it's about what government does after you achieve power. It's a very different choice. Mandela understood it. It required, taking that argument through, testing it, taking that argument all through the campaign. But that definition enabled voters to get much more interested, and also to try to hold leaders accountable afterwards. Blair, there was a similar battle over the choice. When Barack Obama, he ran on change in Iraq. He ran on change in our politics, away from trying to get away from the old partisan, polarization and corrupt special interests in Washington. He ran on unity over division, including but not exclusively racial divisions. He ran on a change in Bush's economic direction, particularly in the general election, and with the last 3 weeks heavily centered on a choice between pursuing an economics that George Bush pursued, focused on the wealthy, versus an economics that's centered on the middle class and rising prosperity for all. Hillary Clinton tried to run on experience and risk. Her slogan was ready on day one. Her billboards said ready. She ran on experience. She tried to make this an election about choice, about experience and risk. That was the fight that she chose. But the country, particularly the primary electorate, was overwhelmingly desperate to vote for change, and understanding the change is the only way you were going to win this election. Understanding that moment, defining the choice, is what I do and what in any campaign you need to do. John McCain also tried to run on experience and national security, and Obama being too great a risk. And he decided and that wasn't working. He decided to try to contest change by being a maverick. But once 15 September came and the entire focus was on the financial crisis, he could not win the battle over change. And so the battle to define the election enables you to marshal the forces that are at work in society and bring the train. So the Obama election was a change election with a clear choice, dramatic change in direction, engagement of society and turnout. And the question is what we learn from it. The one thing we learned was the fact that Obama's understanding of the times, the clarity of the choice he posed, produced a very broad engagement in society. There was a remarkable change in America, both in the political coalitions, in the choice he posed. The political coalitions changed in the country. The level of engagement, particularly of young voters, but also African Americans, Latino, and others. But there was a extraordinary change in engagement produced by the desire for change, the anger about the current direction, the ability of Obama to pose a set of choices that controlled what the election was about, and everything shifted across all groups and all across the country. But it was also an election which brought wholly new ways of communicating and organizing and engaging, impacting polling as well. So you had internet, as the main point of contact for large portions of the population, maybe a majority. Internet fundraising is a dramatic shift with the left now dominating the resources in politics. On-the-ground organizing everywhere, just ordinary, normal organizing. The use of internet and text messaging to genuinely organize enormous rallies and grassroots organization on a large scale. Viral videos, email chains, voters proactively seeking out information on sites that monitor what's true, seeking out the campaigns. 40% of all voters went to websites, initiated it themselves to go to the websites of campaigns. 60% of voters under 30. Moving toward a wholly new way of doing campaigns. So our polling has changed as well. But after '92, when we had Bill Clinton's election, when we had Tony Blair come, Philip Gould came to the war room in Little Rock to witness what we were doing, and he ultimately carried back to Britain the attempt to modernize the party as a precondition for modernizing the nation. But the floor plan of the war room was up in the war room in the Labor Party here before I got here. And ultimately, it was in the war room. It was the floor plan was in the war room in Israel and in South Africa. The impact of '92 was both on how to modernize the party and pose choices, but it was also about how to organize aggressively and change communication. And both things happened after '92, and it carried across the globe. What lessons will we learn? Will progressive parties learn and take from Obama's win? I don't know that, but that history is being written now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Stan, for that. I'm not letting your final remarks lie there. I'm going to pursue that. I'm just going to pose 2 or 3 questions before we open it up to people. First, something which is very interesting in the book, which you referred to in your talk, Stan, which was about this point on political project and life mission, and with advisors not always sharing those of the principles they work for. And in your 2 long chapters on Tony Blair, I think one of the most interesting things, and I'm followed Tony Blair, written about him and so on over the years, was that many respects of his personal life mission differed from other people involved in creating New Labour, as well as advisors like yourself, particularly the religious aspect. Yeah. And that led to quite differences of view which emerged. And related to that is what was quite clear, some of those differences really emerged on Iraq.
Yes. It's true, and I learned more. I learned a lot from Ehud Barak because of things that, because of public opinion shifting in ways that I didn't think was possible. But I learned, Tony Blair was clearly the leader I knew least well, even though I worked for the Labor Party and Blair for the longest period, and intensively. And I, even to this day, I cannot answer why we never tested what he was saying about, his formulation, essentially a one nation, formulation. We never tested in the poll. Now, this was 3 months after I started to work for the Labor Party. I didn't really feel that I could second guess Alistair and Philip and others who were, laying out the choices we were considering, running on. But what struck me, and I have, the surveys that I wrote, that, I have his messages, and where he's talking about wanting to give the Labor conference speech on one nation, and everybody else moaning at that, that idea as too abstract and, not solving a problem that the country's not looking to be solved. We never tested the way he wanted to run, we never tested in the survey. It was I didn't understand it, but it was clearly grounded in his sense of power of community and faith. They didn't want those issues, to be that they were very secular themselves. They believed anytime you talked about religion, you only got in trouble in Britain. This was not in the United States. That's a left-right choice, but that's not a left-right choice here. And so that was suppressed. Now, what I also tried to understand is why. I asked him, after I wrote the book, I asked him the question. I said, why didn't you insist on this alternative this option being up front? And he said, that's why I trusted you to do it. I wanted, to be honest, I don't think he believed it was going to be electorally effective. He surrounded himself, and leaders make that choice. They surrounded him with people. This is his choice. He's surrounding himself with secular people. He has a separate group, which I didn't know about. He had a separate religious group that met weekly during the campaign. The
97 campaign.
During the 97, in advance of the 97 campaign, which he met with weekly, he said that he would talk to them and make sure, kind of a check that he wasn't going too far in his politics, that was getting too far away from his religious faith. But none of those people were introduced into the campaign. That was a separate domain in which those issues weren't allowed to be posed. So after 9/11, he is in some sense liberated to bring together faith and his politics. I think the Iraq War, follows from that, and the alignment with Bush, which also allows him to be more expressive in his faith. I argue, I'm, as you know, frustrated with that choice. And ultimately, it's where the distance develops between us. He's coming to that issue. He's coming to that issue with a totally different worldview. He was talking about power of community. George Bush is talking about power of the individual. They're in a totally different worldview as they come to agree on the Iraq policy, which I think, therefore, was very hard to justify given how much he had to align with George Bush.
Yeah. I mean, following on from that, another point is in each of your leaders, apart from Nelson Mandela, who retired because of age and everything else, ultimately, there was a question mark at the end. Things went wrong.
For all of these, yes.
Yeah, I mean, each of them.
It's not a happy. I didn't just write about happy.
I mean, you have two chapters on most of them, and then or certainly on Clinton and Blair, and then you have the rise, but also the fall. And there's a common theme to that, which I was struck by: the degree to which the leader gets out of touch. I mean, how do you analyse that degree of where things go wrong?
Well, there is. All of them. There's great hope, and then there's despair. They all have, major defeats, great loss of their majority, or defeat, humiliating defeat, or forced out in a violent upheaval. So this is. So you're right to highlight that, drama. It's partially being out of touch, but it's also partially insisting, certainly in Bolivia. Where our polling said you can't do this. Our polling said you can't export, natural gas through Chile because of the intense emotion surrounding that issue, the nationalism opposing going through Chile. He said, I have no point in governing. He understood he was out of touch. They were out of touch, and Blair as well. Blair had a choice. When he was in despair and the trust was at its lowest level, and he was considering not running, and so we were in May and June, July, of 2004. We did a project on trust, in which we put in our data showed there was actually a way back. The people would listen to him on his project if he could show some learning from Iraq, that he could show, which I found hard to believe after everything that had happened in Iraq, that it was not possible to say in a fairly public way that there was some learning about this action. And the other was showing some independence from George Bush, which I suggest not on Iraq, but on climate change. So in both cases, I thought I was talking about an option that was, real, something that he could find comfort. I wrote that it was actionable, and he couldn't do it. he couldn't do either one. He was, and if you look at the conference speech that he gave after that, he basically, he talked about Iraq, but he just couldn't say that he learned anything, any mistakes, anything, any kind of acknowledgement that would allow people to listen. And the same thing on Bush. He wouldn't. He was like, he stayed with Bush to the end, for reasons that I understand. I don't agree with, but I understand. But he couldn't get there. So it wasn't that he was out of touch in the sense he didn't know what he needed to do to get people to listen. It's that, in this case, he believed in the Iraq War. He thought the Iraq War would, alter, that its course was what would decide his fate on that. He also had another, another pollster who was offering another option that said you didn't have to address the Iraq War as a basis for getting people to listen to you. But I think he couldn't get there. So it wasn't a touch. And the same thing in Bolivia. He just couldn't get there.